During the US presidential campaign of last year, we, and many other outlets, warned about the proposed cuts for EV programs threatened by then-candidate Donald Trump. Now he's in the White House, he's making good on those threats, and he's not only vowed to stop future funding of EV tax incentives, but illegally ordered the halting of funds already apportioned by his predecessor's administration, funds that had already been allocated to charging network providers and communities under the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. And while there have been court filings to attempt to reverse the illegal halting of funds, at the time of writing the script and filming it, all NEVI fund disbursement has been halted in contravention of various legal rulings, which means that, for the US at least, we're not going to see any new EV charging stations deployed with federal assistance for at least the next 4 years, something that's dramatically going to impact EV charging station availability and usability in the US. It's likely going to cause some charging networks to suffer sudden and dramatic changes in network reliability, and I'd argue has already begun. Last week, for example, I drove up to Seattle from Portland, Oregon for a medical appointment, and I noticed 2 very important things. Charging stations are being vandalized at an astonishingly rapid rate, and the remaining stations are often oversubscribed, leading to long charging times, long wait times, overheating hardware, and worse. So today we're going to remind everyone about the history of NEVI, dispel some myths about it, look into what's happening right now, tell you what we know, and detail what we think is likely moving forwards for existing EV owners looking to make longer distance EV trips. I'm purposely going to try and minimise the amount of discussion of the White House or DOGE in this video, but it's important to note that we will have to cover some elements because this particular story is, by its very nature, quite political. So let's start with that, because in the lead up to the last US presidential election, we had a slew of news stories complaining about NEVI and it being a quote-unquote waste of government money. We had many news stories erroneously claim, for example, that NEVI funding had paid for a very small number of fast charging stations that cost a very large amount of money. Those who made that claim not only betrayed their ignorance of civics, but also the particular way in which NEVI works. So let's look at that and examine how NEVI operated until, as I'll come to in a moment, it saw its funding illegally halted. NEVI was established as a program under the previous administration, funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, otherwise known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of November 15th, 2001. Its goal is, or maybe was, to disperse federal funding to each US state to explicitly build, quote, a convenient, affordable, reliable and equitable national network of EV chargers, end quote. In order to be considered for funding, each state was required to submit an annual EV infrastructure deployment plan that laid out how the state planned on using its apportioned NEVI formula program funds to build out its respective statewide charging network. Until that plan was approved, no funds were released. States were also required to ensure that their proposals complied with the Federal National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Requirements documentation. This document prescribed the need for minimum numbers of charging stations, minimum uptime for reliability standards, data logging and security, installation and maintenance requirements, signage, network connectivity, and of course, supported plug types, as well as how you paid. Under the programme, $615 million was set aside in 2022 for EV charging, with subsequent years each being allocated $885 million every year. The funds were apportioned according to state size and population, with funds going to the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, in addition to the 50 US states. And while the US federal government has wiped its FHA website of all trace of NEVI, only to show a letter that I'll come to in a moment, I was able to download a bunch of NEVI documentation that we'll link to in the down below that explains how it all worked. Thanks, Internet Archive. You are literally a lifesaver and preserver of history. And maybe thanks to the government officials who either managed to keep their websites hidden or perhaps were so incompetent at the purge that they remained up at the time of writing this. Either way, as they now say, I now have the datas. Support Wikipedia and Internet Archive, folks. The claims from conservative news outlets that the Biden administration spent $7.5 billion on EV charging stations are, as I'm sure you can appreciate, completely and utterly false. First, it's important to note that because of the details I just went through, neither the states nor the charging providers were just handed a blank cheque and told to go buy whatever they wanted, sugar cheeks. Second, in order for funds to be released, states had to first plan how they were going to spend the money, then submit proposals, and then and only then would the money actually start flowing. The passage of government bureaucracy is never quick. Vogon at times. But when dealing with external entities, that process gets even slower. To install a charging station, you need to get approval from the local utility company, a process which can take months, as anyone who's needed to increase their home electrical supply can attest. You then have to get buy-in from the local city or town planning council. You need to get all of those permits pulled before you can even start digging. It takes time. Which brings me to what we know thus far. It's not clear, unfortunately, exactly how much of the money has already been allocated for yearly EV charging rollout has actually been dispersed. And we can hope that funds from previous years have largely been paid out. But based on conversations I've had with folks on the ground and in the industry, that's not actually a given. It appears that all funding disbursement, both for current and previous years, has currently been completely halted. The letter that is now posted on the FHWA website in place of the original NEVI information portal states that all funding has been frozen. All programme guidance and all plans for fiscal years have been immediately halted, and state employees, charging network providers and advocacy groups are very much in the dark. Don't worry, I'll link to the letter in the down below. As we're writing and filming this video, I should point out that the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, who I might note said during his confirmation hearing that he wanted to halt all EV support and implement taxes on people who drive EVs, said on Fox Business that any NEVI obligations that have been made or contracts that have been signed will still be funded. But that doesn't actually vibe with what I'm hearing is happening on the ground. That companies who are deploying charging stations are being told that they don't know if they'll get the money for half-finished sites or not. And that leads us to what we know right now, that is. Last week, I headed up to Seattle for a last-minute medical appointment. I was able to leave my house with a full charge and just about made it to Seattle without stopping. But in order to get back home, I needed to find a fast charger. Finding one that was functional was difficult. Multiple sites that I visited had vandalized charging stations with inoperable or broken screens. Some had had their cables stolen, and one charging site I found prior to my appointment that actually worked was rate limited to about 50 kilowatts. And I'm going to assume that the massive dent in the side of that particular unit might have been to blame. Driving home, I was able to stop midway and charge, and again, I encountered more broken charging stations and people queuing to charge. And bear in mind that this is a busy route between two very liberal cities on the US West Coast, and based on the conversations I'm having with friends and family, more and more charging infrastructure is being vandalized or is not working. More cables are being stolen, and in some parts of the country, red-blooded fans of the current White House are purposely parking in EV charging spaces and then daring folks to question them and ask them to move so they can actually charge. I don't know about you, but if I'm on my own and I'm tired and in an unknown place, I'm not going to demand someone in a lifted pickup truck with racist bumper stickers moves the vehicle. especially if I think they're carrying a gun. Most of the charging network operators seem to be doing everything they can, within reason, to repair charging stations, but given that priority is generally going to rolling out new infrastructure rather than repair existing stuff, I think things are going to get worse before they get better. It's also worth noting here that some of the NEVI funding was meant to be for continuing maintenance on existing EV infrastructure, and if that's not coming, well, it's likely some stations will be left in a state of disrepair for longer. And the reasons for that are pretty simple. NEVI funding requirements included a network reliability metric. If funding isn't coming, there's less urgency to repair charging networks in less populated areas. Rural sites, for example, will be less important for charging networks as those sites tend to make less money than networks in busy, heavily populated areas. People are also less likely to notice and report a vandalized or non-functional charging station at a less frequently visited site, so it may take even longer for it to be noticed and then longer for it to be repaired. Networks will ultimately look to maximise ROI and focus on keeping busy urban and highly utilised trunk route sites online, will force them to have priority over cross-country trips. And of course, I should note that Tesla's supercharger network, which has been funded historically by the relatively high cost of its vehicles, is in direct competition to the charging networks that more heavily rely on NEVI funding. Cutting this funding gives an advantage to Tesla, something Elon Musk has acknowledged multiple times over the last 6 months or so, as he's encouraged the federal government to stop all EV funding. If you are in a position of market dominance, you're going to be much more happy to see programs that aim to level the playing field disappear. Of course, the halting of NEVI funding, and the whole programme as a whole, will ultimately reduce the number of charging stations deployed across the US. It might influence how easily you can travel across the country, and it could result in the death of some smaller charging providers. But it doesn't mean that all deployment will be culled. We know, for example, that some networks, particularly ones owned by large multinational fossil fuel companies, will likely be less impacted by this. They obviously may choose not to deploy for other reasons. Reasons like prolonging the death rattle of the gasoline vehicle's demise for a few extra $1 billion of profit. But they will be less impacted by the halting of NEVI funding. Luckily, though, some states are already making noise about stepping up to the plate and providing alternative assistance through their own state-sponsored programs. States that tend to lean towards liberal and blue are more likely to offer charging network funding through grants or loans to help establish EV charging networks in their region. But that will depend very much on where you live. It will also depend on the financial situation in individual states. And legislatures in liberal states are well aware that the current administration is fond of punishing states that did not vote for it and will leverage every opportunity to financially imperil those states. So we can expect that some charging networks, especially those that are publicly traded and have auto industry backing or VC funding, while they might continue to deploy their infrastructure, will also increase pricing. Without a joint agency coordinating what they can or cannot do, there will be more fragmentation in the space and more spotty deployment. And as I just noted, the cost of charging will soar. The reasons for this are easy. If a network is being funded by VC, private equity, or the open stock market, there's going to be a much heavy emphasis on return on investment. Without financial assistance to cover deployment costs, we can expect networks in parts of the US where alternative funding, where state-sponsored programs aren't available, to become a whole lot more expensive to use. And in some parts, that will result in worse coverage for EV owners. So, how do we deal with this all? Well, the first thing is to get politically active and to ensure that you reach out to your Congress critter regularly. Call them, write to them, invite them to your little one's school play. As Kate is fond of noting, They're precious, lonely little souls who benefit greatly from your attention. More seriously, though, Congress critters, regardless of whether they're lawful good or chaotic evil, turns out do eventually respond to sufficient pressure from their constituents. The massive number of calls the current House and Senate have been receiving from the horrified populace has been having an effect. Slowly, but having an effect. So it's vital we keep that all up. Next, join a community group. Advocate for local charging deployment, work with your local government, and explain why EV charging is important to them. And push for that message to be sent to Capitol Hill too. Encourage, no, scratch that, demand that better rules are made about providing charging infrastructure in rental and multi-family accommodation. Rules that don't place the financial cost to improve a property on the renter, but instead shift it to the landlord or property developer. Make a noise. Go speak at your local council's meetings. Provide testimony to your state legislature. Show the damage that's being done. And don't be afraid to hold people's metaphorical feet to the metaphorical fire. Additionally, if you are so inclined, support organisations like the Internet Archive. And hey, if you want to, start archiving your own government website stuff. Because right now, literally tens of thousands of pages are being destroyed on a daily basis and mysteriously disappeared because they aren't in line with current governmental policy. Although, to be clear, I think it's fudging hilarious that the White House decided that words like equity and inclusion were mass deleted from its website using what appears to be a very, very basic grep functionality, or for those less technically minded, find and replace, or find and delete, leading to many hundreds of web pages on the IRS website vanishing because someone forgot that words can have multiple meanings. And when talking about tax, being able to use equity, inclusion, and division is kind of important. You should also join sites like PlugShare, ChargeWay, A Better Route Planner, and many others. Report when charging stations are broken or vandalized, even if you're not using them and you just happen to be parking nearby. Take photographs, check in when they work and when they don't. Help those third-party tools gain a better real-world idea of which stations are good and which ones aren't, because if we crowdsource our data, it's likely to help folks avoid being stranded on the road. It's also harder for companies to massage data and claim that things are better than they really are. And if you are someone who does need to take long-distance trips in your EV, plan routes that are easily manageable if something goes wrong. Don't drive from full to empty. A, B, C. Always be charging. If you need to stop after 150 miles to have a wee-wee in a sticky bun, obviously not at the same time. That'd just be weird. Plan those stops to coincide where possible with a charging station. If you come across a functional charging station, use it so you can test it. And make sure you report that you had a good experience on one of those apps I just mentioned. Be conservative, with a small c, when it comes to your route planning. Sure, your EV may be good for 300 miles in ideal conditions, but you and I both know that it's safer to plan for 240. Take longer routes with more potential charging than shorter ones that are more direct that have no redundancy. Don't push your car to its limits unless you're willing to deal with the possibility that a charging network might be broken. I used to think that every EV owner understood this, but then I realised that the techniques that I, and pretty much every greying EV owner out there, use as a matter of course, are actually learned behaviours from a time before when EV charging networks really were terrible, horrible, no good, and you couldn't rely on them. And if you're listening to all of this and screaming in anguish, I get it. Modern EV ownership is much different to how it used to be. It's supposed to be better than this. But by culling EV charging infrastructure, by trying to make it harder to own and drive an EV, those with deep pockets want you to give up on EVs. Or they maybe want you to buy their particular type of EV. And if you like your particular type of EV and you'd like to continue driving it, you may have to make some adjustments. I'm sorry, and that sucks. But it also means you don't necessarily have to suddenly go back to driving ICE. In fact, to be honest, sticking with EVs, continuing to do long-distance trips, patronising networks that provide good quality service, although maybe avoiding the one from the company that starts with T and ends with just a few other letters might also send a message to you-know-who, and sharing all of that experience with others is an act of defiance that we need. Just like installing solar panels or supporting a local wind farm or opposing more fossil fuel drilling. As we are fond of saying, existence is resistance, and that's true for whatever part of your life those in power have deemed un-American, evil, or just woke. Thanks for joining us today, and if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them in our Discord chat room on our Patreon page in the down below, or you can reach out to us on Mastodon or Blue Sky. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling by on your screen right now. They're part of the massive community of supporters who make this channel possible, helping us through Patreon and YouTube, helping cover our bills, paying our team, and ensuring that we can remain 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here, just follow the links below. We've got options available across a wide range of different price points, starting from just $1.50 US a month. A massive welcome to our newest supporters: Dana Pearson, Bruce C95, Kaluk, Chip Chandler, Dave Nelson, Nathan Sievers, Boris Reingold, and Callie Electro Dad. To join the list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member today for your moment of fame. And you can even gift membership to someone else. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll also find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations, and we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at for the time being, address listed below. You'll also find links to our swag store, and if you are someone who has to shop on Amazon, please consider using our affiliate link so we get the commission, not Jeff Bezos. So we can continue focus on making our content even better and reducing burnout. We're being a little freer with our release days, but we plan on releasing new content every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday on our main channel, plus something on Sunday over on Transport Evolved Take 2. And if you want more, the algorithm that currently hates us thinks you should watch this video, but we think this one is one they think you should watch as well. Be awesome, be kind, be intentional, and don't forget to resist. Keep evolving.